It's my really great pleasure to have with us virtually here Professor Xiao Xiao from Copenhagen Business School. Xiao is a researcher in information systems that's always on the verge. Her research areas are digital platforms, e-commerce in China, sports digitalization, and among her many interests, she's also an expert on qualitative research methods. So that really fits well with our theme of this doctoral seminar on qualitative research methods.
Thank you for inviting me to give this guest lecture here. So my name is Xiao, and just a little bit sort of overview of my life. I was born and raised in China, and this is where my hometown is. My hometown is like 2 hours away from Wuhan. I actually went to university there for 4 years, so I have very fond memory of the city. After I graduated in China, I went to the US and first did a master degree in accounting with a specialization in information system auditing and control, and decided to move away from accounting. I really hated it, and then decided to do a PhD in management information systems at Washington State University, which is a middle of nowhere small town called Pullman in Washington State, very far away from Seattle. So I joined CBS almost the same time as Teal, 2013. So we're among the same cohort. We also got tenure together in 2017. So Teal is a very good colleague and friend. I think I don't have anything to add because I think Teal already mentioned it. Maybe just one thing, if some of you are wondering why I'm doing sports digitalization, is because I'm a quite fanatic football fan. I've been watching football, especially European football, since, I don't know, when I was in high school. So that's like 20 years ago. But I support Italy though, so sorry about that. My plan for today is that I will talk a little bit about how this paper or how this project started, because the paper we have written for JIS is the second half of the project we started back in 2011. And so around 2010, we started this project. And at the beginning, we just wanted to understand the status quo of qualitative research in IS. So it started as more like a review project. We reviewed all the qualitative research published in the top 4 journals, so Quarterly, ISR, JMIS, and JIS for the last, I think we started in 2000 and ended at the time, so 2011. And we just want to see what is the status, right? And we first published this paper in ISIS, so we presented in ISIS Orlando. And then later on, this paper appeared as a quarterly guest editorial. We actually tried to submit the paper, I think, to ISR at the time, but it was a painful process. And we didn't go very far because this type of paper is always very contentious, and really depending on the camp or the genre, let's say, you come from, you have very different opinions about how things work, right? So this would be, I would say, the first half of the project where it's mostly just review. So you can take a look at this guest editorial where we basically analyze all these papers in a way that is almost like dissecting them into different components and do sort of analysis on each of the components, right? That's why we use the analogy here. Now, the second part of the paper, or the second part of the project, which was, again, it's this genre paper, which again, we tried to submit to maybe quarterly, I forgot, but again, we didn't succeed. So ended up being another editorial. This paper is, you could say, a step further, right? So in the first half of the project, we were quite critical in terms of the current status, in terms of quality research. And we also saw that there are lots of so-called inconsistencies in the papers that have been actually published in these premier journals. So naturally, this is the second step. It's like, okay, we have a problem here. We do see that it's not too much of a mature status when it comes to quality research, especially in certain genres. So what should be the next step? What is the solution or the guidelines, more concrete guidelines we can give? Because in the MLS quarterly guest editorial, we only gave some very high level principles, whereas in the JAIS editorials you read, it's quite concrete sort of, at least we provided references and concrete sort of criteria or things to look for, to guidance in this part. So this is a short story of how the project developed into what it was. We sort of concluded the project after the JIS paper was published. The genre paper started with 3 questions we had when we saw that there are confusions, there are inconsistencies, and there are chaos, so to say, in some of the papers we reviewed. So if there are already chaos there, because those are the papers that have gone through supposedly very systematic review process, but we can still see that some of them are problematic. So then we can imagine the confusions that researchers might have when they are undertaking the projects. And also, I think Pertic himself has been you could say, first or very early generation quality researchers. He has carried many of these questions as he gone through all the review process himself when he submit quality research. So these are the 3 questions we start with, right? So first is that the criteria and value we should hold dear or sacred when we both conducting a quality study and evaluating. And second one is, what are the concerns, or you could say threats, we need to address when we conduct a qualitative research? And then lastly, what are some of the methodological references, both we as authors, but also as reviewers and editors, we should utilize when we conduct and evaluate qualitative research? So those are the 3 questions we use as a starting point. So there's some examples of the criteria that often you have seen in many of these reference papers regarding qualitative research, right? So I will not repeat here. And then in terms of methodological references, if you take a look, this is actually from the first part of the project where we analyzed, I think it was around, I would say 100 papers we have analyzed, and we did a word cloud, right? Regarding the main methodological references they used. And I don't think there's much surprise here. So these are all very popular qualitative methodologies we cite in our discipline, right? So Yin is the champion in this regard, but Klein, Myers, and Huberman, and then Eisenhardt, they're all quite highly cited, right? But the question is, of course, then are they being used in the right way, in the right context? In terms of the concerns, I don't know if you have had the experiences with submitting quality research, but some of these concerns are actually from, I think, super directly pulled out from the review package he has received, right? In some of the submissions he had regarding, for instance, the lacking richness, the source of bias, how did the process go actually, and how about generalizability, all these very common concerns we often raise with qualitative study. Since you have read the paper, I think you would understand that the answer to the 3 questions in terms of criteria, concern, and references is that it depends. So that's one of the main message you will want to give out to people, especially junior faculty or PhD students who just start a journey, right? Is that qualitative study is not a monolithic school. It has different genres. It has different sets of methodological approaches. And depending on the genre and depending on the approach, you need to make a choice. And then you have different criteria and concerns and references. So that's our sort of premise and objective. We just want to identify and highlight the differences among the different types or different genres of the studies, and also offer some preliminary guidelines, right? So what are the references or methodological references you actually should go to? So you could use our paper as a, how do you call that? Like a yellow phone book. I'm not sure if you guys are old enough to know those things, but basically you look at this map and think about which genre you belong to, and then go further into the references we provided, use them as the methodological guideline for concrete guidelines you would like to use. There are 4 elements that sort of decide the genre of a qualitative research. Maybe decide is not the right word, but how we use or think about data and the nature of role of theory, the data analysis strategy, and the nature and claim about the findings. So basically, these are four very interrelated components of a qualitative research that will indicate or will be dictated by the genre of the qualitative research. So data, theory, analysis, and then the nature of the findings, right? The other aspect of it is then that there needs to be some coherence across these four elements, right? So we need to make sure that the choices we make or how we approach these four elements are aligned, right? So that's, again, that's one of the main points of this paper is the internal coherence. Based on that, we just mapped out the prominent, and we call first generation quality research, right? Because again, it's evolution. For instance, you don't see, I know you guys read about critical realist case study, right? And it's not there. Actually, it is there, but it is in the same category as explorative case study because it's a 2-dimension chart. It's not a 3-dimension chart. And because of this particular philosophical assumptions related to critical realism, there's no way for us to present it as a separate set along this 2-dimension figure. So this is why we say it's a first generation genres. And then as each subgenre matures, you could argue that you can create a small map for each of these subgenres as they evolve. As of now, you can see that even within interpretive case study and hermeneutics, it's a wide range, right? There are diversities within each subgenres. But we would like to first start with these ones. Those are the basic starting points, right? As we mature into, or as we get more interested with, let's say, GTM, there are then different subgroups within GTM you can look more into. But for now, we need to understand how GTM is different from, let's say, hermeneutics, how positive case study is different from ethnographic studies, right? So this is just to say, by no means a comprehensive representation of all the qualitative research genres out there. And this is just a starting point. That's why we call it first generation. I think it's also the first generation in our discipline. So if you look at a different discipline, maybe it will be different too.
And you're also writing on the upper left a small subset of qualitative research.
Yeah,
so
exactly. If it's a 3D map, then we'll be able to fit in more. Right? The 2 dimensions, so the interpretation-centric versus data-centric, it is similar to what we call a more objectivist point view of the world versus more subjectivist. But there's some controversies in terms of this very extreme view on either objectivist versus either subjectivist, or use data-centric versus interpretation-centric, because the idea here, we want to emphasize how we view data, right? Whether we view data or text as just facts, like a representation of facts, or we think that there's no way that data once, or the text, once it is detached from the original context that it was created, there's no way it can represent any facts. There's no facts to start with, right? So it's very much about the researcher's interpretation, our interpretation of it, given the context we're in. And then inductive versus deductive, I think that one I don't really need to explain much. It's self-explanatory, right? So then these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You could say 6 because we interpretive case study and ethnography sort of overlap in this map, right? These are the 6 genres we ended up with. And then we, of course, went into a little bit slightly more nuanced discussion on how within each genre, data, theory, analysis, and findings are treated differently, right? So how does a positive case study, the data, the theory, the analysis, and the claim differ when it is interpretive case study? And then there are also nuances within one bubble, right? As you can see, hermeneutics and also interpretive case study, we still have a more sort of impressionist stream, more on the interpretive side, versus there are ones that is more on the data-centric side, right? And then with positive case study, we also have studies that really aims at validating or falsifying a theory, so has using a more hypothetical deductive logic, versus the, you could say, some people call it a more soft positivism, in the sense that they do not really testing any hypothesis per se, but they try to actually generate falsifiable propositions. So it's a little bit more on the inductive side, right? So how to use this? You read all this in the paper, so I'm not going to repeat them. But what I would like to emphasize is sort of the use case. First thing is, this is not for you to use it as, okay, I want to do a positive case study, and this is how I treat data theory analysis claim. In a way, yes, but I think our goal is for you first to see that there are these options here. There are these options here. You need to make choices. Now, how to make choices very much depend on the tradition you come from. Say, I, as researchers, inherently, I have a very positivist mindset. I cannot really think about or make sense of, the so-called interpretation centric. There is no reality. Everything is, there is no truth. If I cannot really deal with or make sense of that philosophical stance, then there's no point in forcing yourself to that part of the picture, right? Basically, the philosophical paradigm that you yourself are comfortable with, right? That's number one. Number two is, of course, if you have some theory that you would like to use or fits your research, and then the theory itself, certain theories has its own philosophical sort of assumptions, right? And so that will also have an influence in terms of how this particular theory can be used, because certain theory simply cannot be used as generating falsifiable propositions. They are more like a lens that you can use to look at a phenomenon. Maybe they can provide a very general framework you can work with. You cannot develop a hypothesis from it, right? So that's another thing. The third thing is also, I guess, the type of data that is available. I think to be on the more data-centric side, I think there is more requirement in terms of the quantity of the data points you're gathering, and then compared to maybe on the more interpretation-centric side. Famously, my super said, he was able to publish an interpretive case study with 6 interviews, right? When we did the review, there was one category we called number of interviews done, and the range was from 6 to, I think, 100 something. So he was he claimed the minimal part, but then the interview itself is so rich. It's just full of with what we call like golden quotes, right? It's full of tension. It's full of stories. And that's why he was able to use that and then create a very interesting, I think it was published in Jamie's, and use actor network theory, and then to talk about the business process re-engineering. And that was a great paper, only based on 6 interviews. But if you only have 6 interviews, I think it will be very hard to do a grounded theory or to do a positive case study, right? So again, the nature of the data you have, it's also quite important to make a decision. So this is to say that sometimes our options are limited by realities. We're not in full control of the realities. And then our options are also limited by your research question, by your own philosophical preferences, and then by the nature of the project that you deal with, right? So it's not a free-for-all choice. So maybe you look at the map and then looking into these 4 areas, and then you realize, okay, these are the 2-3 genres maybe I will be able to work with. And then, of course, the nature of the findings in the end also speak to the purpose of the project. So for grounded theory method, it's very good at developing theory. So that's why it's called grounded theory methodology, right? So it's very inductive. And also grounded theory methodologies, it's a very systematic data analysis process. I mean, there are some variation depending on which school you follow, like the Bayesian school or the Straussian school, but regardless, you have the 3 steps of data analysis, right? It's quite structured. If there's not much literature in the area, and then your goal is to create some sort of mid-range theory, then grounded theory methodology is a very good choice. I think it's a choice that can resonate a lot with people who may be used to do more quantitative study that is used to follow a very strict, you could say, procedure. It's very systematic in that way. Whereas positive case study, I think one of the German professors is really good at this is Jens Dieben. I think one of the very good positive case study we saw is Dieben et al. 2008. I think it's the quarterly special issue on IS outsourcing. They literally did hypothesis testing, right? They have built a research framework, research model, and they tested the hypothesis with a multi-case study. Very good work. I think Dieben's work is more filled in the area of positive case study, including the later ones he has, right? Whereas explorative case study, I would say use it with a caution because it's the least well-defined. When people don't know what the genre is, they say, okay, it's an exploratory case study. As I said, critical realistic study fill in there. So I think it's the least defined. And somehow we would say that In's case study book sort of fills into this category, right? Or the intersection between exploratory case study and a positive case study. Whereas with interpretive case study, the key here is interpretation, right? I think certain studies that deal with culture, with power, with, you know, where you get very rich data, as the case I have talked about, then I think interpretive case study can be the place to go. Wallstrom has published quite some guidelines there. And I think another great scholar who has done many work in interpretive case studies, Rudy Hirshine. I think they had a paper in Quarterly where they used 3 different theories to interpret the same case and reach different conclusions. So that was also a very interesting paper to look into. Whereas ethnography, I think from this map is the same, but I think I would like to say that ethnography, it's a much more intensive field work is required. So you need to go native, so to speak, right? You need to be at the organization, do observation. So observation is a very important tool, plays a more important role here when it comes to ethnography. I think now it's become more relevant because of virtual ethnography. So Hein did lots of work there, or nethnography. I think now you can do observation online, and that can be something quite interesting to look into. And with hermeneutics, I think is the genre I know least about. It's very much about interpretation of text, right? Reading of text. It basically was born from the technique people use to understand, to interpret ancient texts. A lot of hermeneutics is about understanding this iterative process between understanding a fragment of the text versus understanding the text as a whole. So you have to constantly go back and forth. So you look at part of the text, then you zoom out to look at the, you know, because of the understanding of this part, maybe you develop a new understanding of the whole, and then you go back to reinterpret. So there's a very iterative process between parts and whole. That's the hermeneutics, right? But of course, the hermeneutic principle, the iterative process, right? How you always need to go back and forth between parts of the data and versus the overarching findings. I think that has been incorporated in many of the, for instance, the Klein-Meyer's 7 principles. One of it is hermeneutic circle, right? But I think we need to differentiate it between the hermeneutic circle versus hermeneutics as a methodology. The extra thing I would like to say here is that there is a difference between a method and a methodology. For instance, grounded theory. Grounded theory, many of us use grounded theory coding method. So open axial selective coding, right? But that doesn't mean that you're following the grounded theory methodology, because methodology is much at a higher level and has sort of a principles or a number of issues you need to tackle. Like with grounded theory method, the coding method, you just do the coding. Whereas the methodology has requirement regarding the design. For instance, ideally you should collect data, the collection and data analysis should go in a concurrent manner, right? And also it talks about theoretical sampling. Basically, as you develop theory, you see where you need more data. So that's where the theoretical sampling comes into play. And then it talks about theoretical saturation, right? How you stop the study when the theory is saturated, so to speak. So we do also need to make such a differentiation understand the connotations related to methodology. This slide, I don't want to spend too much time, but basically once you have decided, made a choice, then there are certain criteria that or baggages that come with the choice, right? So with positive case study, then it's very much like you say quantitative study, where you need to talk about reliability, validity, and even the degrees of freedom, right? And that's where Dube and Paris work, their paper comes into play to be a very good guidelines, right? And whereas if you are doing an ethnographic study, I think this Golden Bible and log paper of the criteria then come into play, right? So this is after you made the choice, you have to make sure that you follow the criteria. And this is two ways, right? But first is both that how you, when you design your study, when you conduct your study, you need to make sure that these criteria are fulfilled. That's number one. Number two is that by doing so, you send a signal that this is how you think your study should be judged upon. And that's very important. I cannot emphasize more, because when reviewers who are looking at your paper, he or she may come with their own sort of familiar references or their own preferred genre. But you cannot let their preference dictate how they judge yours. But you as the author, what you can do is you make it very transparent and also very clear. I'm doing a positive case study, and hence I'm following Dube and Paris guideline, and this is how I did it, right? So you make it very clear to the readers that what is your choice, and based on this choice, these are the criteria that should be used to judge my study. So it's both ways, right? Both when you design and then conduct the study, as well as sending the signal to the audience in terms of the criteria that should be used to judge yours. I didn't include that slide, which basically is this table in our paper where we give references to each one of the methodological reference to each one of the points, right? The genres and also subgenres. For those of you who are interested in one particular type, I would then can go into those references and look for more specific guidelines. I'd like to end with two messages, right? Which I have already mentioned many times. And this is the two overarching, we actually had, I think, 5, 6 principles, but I think these two are most important. These are from the quarterly editorial, right? The principle of variety, both as an author and as a reader. So accept that there are these different types and genres, right? And then, as I said, those are just small subset, and within each genre, there's more granular distinctions. So as an author, you need to make a choice. So you cannot just say, okay, I'm doing a qualitative study, that's it, right? So you need to make a choice. And then as a reader, be receptive to the genres that maybe you're not used to or you're not familiar with, right? So be open-minded in a way, and that there are variety out there. Second, very important is this internal coherence. So the second part of our paper of 2018, part 2, literally showed an example. That example is not exaggerated example at all. We did not dramatize it for the paper. This is a paper published in one of the top 4 journals, and it was just a mess, right? In terms of lack of internal coherence. So I feel like all the references that we have listed in the table most of them have been used in this paper. So there is definitely a lack of internal coherence with this paper. The second very important issue is to make sure that the choices you made are conscious choice, and you made them based on your own preference, the goal of the study, the type of data you have, and the type of finding you would like to end with. And then stick to it and be consistent and transparent about it, so that you can produce a study of high quality when it comes to, research design and research process. But also that when people come to judge you, they have a very clear understanding of boundaries that you have laid out. So those are the two overarching principles that I would like to end with.
And those apply whatever genre you choose.
Exactly. So this is just general principles that I think if you only remember two things I said today, this will be the two things I would like you to remember. It sounds very common sense in a way, but it's quite hard to execute when you do quality research and when you go through the process, the review process. So you need to have this sort of defend yourself in a way as well. All right, I think that's all I have. Thank you. And then any questions and then comments, please feel free.
Thank you. Let's first give a hand to energize ourselves and energize you after this wonderful, enlightening, but I guess also a little bit exhausting recap of the history of your paper and the different genres. So yeah, let's open the floor for questions. And I have this wonderful microphone, so I can just pass it to whoever wants to.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Is it possible to have more grand theories, formal theories also with interpretive case research? Since my personal opinion was that it's maybe too much about the meanings and deviances, while I think Till was more in the position, okay, but why would that rule out each other? Can you clarify on that?
This is a very good question. So I think there are variations even within the interpretive case study. So as you can see, we have F and E, right? What Theo was saying is that, you know, you can actually develop some sort of new framework or theory as a result of an interpretive case study. Of course, the nature of the theory you develop here would be quite different from the theory you would develop maybe from, let's say, a grounded theory or a, you know, inductive positive case study, right? But it is possible that the findings would be some sort of a new framework or some sort of mid-range theory, so to say. Whereas if you're very much on the other side, which is the F, which is very much about interpretation, then probably not, because that's not the goal. It's more about how you, because of your interpretation, as you say, the focus on the meaning, right? The focus on the interpretation. Your goal is actually to enlighten people with some sort of novel understanding of the phenomenon or of the situation or of the case or of the event or of whatever the subject of the study. So I think it does depend a little bit on where along this continuum you will be. And that's why with a more, you could say, a more realist interpretive study, I think Walsham, to an extent, Klein-Myers, they actually do fall into that more right-hand side. Whereas on the left-hand side, the impressionists, I think, then it's more like Golden Bido and Locke, their paper where they talk about interpretive field study or ethnographic studies, right, where it's more focused on interpretation. I heard that you guys will go through some more concrete examples of these different genres, right? But Walsham and then Emmanuel Vast, VAAST, she, and to an extent, I think Latanya Lavina, they, especially Vast, she very much belongs to this more realist, the category E. They always develop some sort of theory or theoretical framework as a result of an interpretive study. So I would say take a look at their, especially Emmanuel Vast. I think Vast is Walsham student, so you will find like Vast and Walsham, they have published a couple papers in ISR. Just for more concrete examples of what kind of theory that can come out of it. I hope that answers your question.
Just for the sake of variety, then I will chip in with a question. And you can leave this slide up. You mentioned that in this two-dimensional map, there's one dimension missing to adequately represent anything that follows a critical realist paradigm. How would you call that dimension that is missing? Can you say a bit more about that? Or?
Yeah, again, I'm not an expert in critical realism, but I think with critical realism, the ontological assumption is that there is, it's like a stranded reality, right? But there is a reality. And then whereas the epistemological assumption is more towards, you could say, aligned with the interpretivism. That's why these two, the ontological and the epistemological assumptions, are a mix. So we cannot really put them on the data-centric versus interpretation-centric side, because at least originally those are called more objectivist versus subjectivist. So you would differentiate ontological assumption versus epistemological assumption and create an extra dimension there, right? Because it sits sort of in between. Whereas the ones we have, they can be put into a interpretivist versus a positivist continuum. What we're trying to say is that we're working with a naive assumption of the interpretivist versus positivist continuum. That's why it's a 2x2 in a way. But there are so many philosophical assumptions we cannot capture in this continuum, right? I mean, if we also think about design science, we think about pragmatism and all that, we cannot really capture it there. So I think that would be the answer to your question.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
I'm so much interested in qualitative research, so I'm happy to ask a few questions. We have been talking about Yin and also this morning and his categories of cases, and he has this category of an average case. Question that came up then is, are there situations where such average cases would be beneficial to generate new knowledge? We did not come up with a conclusive answer.
Well, I think the sampling of cases really depends on your research question. If the research question, or maybe also from a theoretical point of view, from the theory you're using sort of dictates that you're looking for a common pattern, let's say data analytics technology in a sports organization. If the goal is to understand the sort of the process, let's say the general process of how things go, maybe it makes sense to have an average case, right? Or if in the context of your study, there are not too much variations in terms of, I don't know, on whatever level you are capturing, there are not too much variations, then it also makes sense to find an average case. There's no easy answer, one-off answer to this. When I'm teaching a research method course, that's always my answer. Right? It really depends. But I think the general sort of rule of thumb is that if there's not so much variation in terms of the characteristics you're trying to capturing, then it makes sense to just take average cases. Or if you're trying to capture something that is more on a generic or on a very general level, right? So going back to the sports example, if it's about the process, then probably makes sense to look into average case. But if it's about success, then maybe, you need to look into variations, right? The different degrees of success. And then you need to look into maybe the extreme case where someone did it very well versus someone who failed miserably. I think maybe lastly is that sometimes it's also our wishful thinking that we have a choice, but in reality we don't. And then we have to argue for the same. I'm being very, I'm Chinese, so I'm very pragmatic. Sometimes it's a matter of actually arguing in a post hoc matter. You already have the case, you sort of need to make sense of, what's your sampling logic. That's why also often people use average case, because that's the argument they can come up with in a way.
And I think, Xiao, you also gave kind of another answer in between, because you said if you're moving into a new field like sports digitalization and the use of analytics where not much is published, then I think you have a good justification for using an average case, because hey, then we need to know what's going on in the average digitalized sports company. But when you're studying something like acceptance of information systems or ERP implementation success or whatever, it might be a bit boring to then go for an average case. I think Fabian has another question.
I read the article from Eisenhardt, Building Theories from Case Study Research, and in this article there was written that this article is based on grounded theory, but in your article, you categorized it into the positivist case study.
Yes.
And my question is, why did you do this?
All right, thank you. First of all, if you look at the figure, there's some overlap, at least from a deductive, inductive, data-centric point of way. They all hit in this spot where it's more inductive, but at the same time, it's very data-centric, right? I think I mentioned in my presentation, there's a difference between grounded theory method versus grounded theory methodology. We treated ground theory methodology as a genre in itself, but we've seen interpretive case studies, positive case studies, basically many case studies that qualitative studies that have a more inductive approach to use grounded theory coding, right? So this data analysis process, the three-step data analysis process. But the whole research design logic is not fully captured by grounded theory methodology. So this whole, parallel data collection and data analysis, theoretical sampling, saturation, all these elements are not there. That's why I think we want to treat grounded theory methodology as a subgenre, and it has its own references points, whereas I think inductive positive case that you can use grounded theory coding method as Eisenhardt was suggesting, but it's still ultimately a case study, right? You follow the design logic of a case study rather than a GTM.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Should we do one final question?
Yeah, that's fine.
The folks are getting hungry here, but also hungry for more knowledge. So this is Caroline.
Hi.
Hi.
We have this morning discussed the question of triangulation. What is the role of triangulation in any of these fields? It's a complicated question, but maybe a short overview.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Good question. So I don't think triangulation applies to all genres, because triangulation basically is to try to increase the validity of the data, right? So you triangulate the finding with multiple evidence, right? Especially evidence collected from multiple data sources. So both from different point of view, but also like maybe secondary data versus primary data. In that sense, it does not really matter much to the very interpretive centric end, because they don't even believe there is a reality. They don't think it matters, right? Then there's nothing to triangulate for. That's why I think on the data, very much data-centric, and so positive case study, grounded theory and explorative case study to a certain extent, especially positive case study and explorative case study, I think is very much relevant. Grounded theory method, I think they don't really talk about it much, because they believe this whole iterative data collection and data analysis process in itself, and then this is the three-level data analysis process itself is very solid way, especially when you keep gathering new data, right? And then to validate what you already have, but develop new insights, that process itself is sufficient. And so is, hermeneutics, this H, the author intentional text. Also, they don't talk about triangulation, because usually it's just one set of texts. They don't really deal with multiple sources of data per se, but it's one set of text. And then by going through the iterative process between the parts and the whole, and this moving back and forth will take care of the issue related to validity, right? So I think short answer is most relevant would be for positive case study and exploratory case study. And I think that's one of the key criteria that is often mentioned for these two genres when it comes to triangulation.
Then I'm not seeing any more hands raised. I think we had a good question and answers. With that, Xiao, thank you very much for joining us here virtually. Let's give it another strong applause.
Bye, thank you.